and I do believe that it is time to start the hot topic. But before we do, just real quick, I got some feedback from somebody who has watched one of the shows and wound up buying the CDs to go along with your books, and they were absolutely flabbergasted at how different it made the study of the books, because you can read it cover to cover. OutreachJudaism.org, you can find Rabbi Singer's books there, volumes 1 and 2. If you've got volume 1 already from before, okay, and I'm going to push this out there. If you've got the cassette tapes, that's right. Rabbi, how old are you? If you've got the cassette tapes, give them to somebody or save them. Put them in a safe. Okay, buy yourself a fresh set, because now the volume 1 and 2 is more exhaustive. It's more thorough. The print is so huge. It's wonderfully delicious, as Rabbi would say. Get those books, because they're really the books with the CDs. You can buy the books, and if you're just a real genius, me, I love listening to it. My wife loves listening to the CDs with it. It just makes everything so much easier to take in. It's like putting all the right tools together before you study. It's fascinating. So, okay, Rabbi, we will move on now to today's hot topic, which is the Jews. Technically, were they the killers of the prophets and of Jesus? Did the Jews kill Jesus as well? We have many more questions. The phone lines are open. By the way, Rabbi, I think I've got the phone lines fixed already. So if we go long enough to get more calls, I'll be able to separate them. But for now, if you're interested in calling, wait for a little while, because this topic is going to take just a little bit. So be patient with us. And Rabbi, I'm going to pass this on to you. So all you viewers out there, like I said, 855-952-4253 if you need that number, but hold on to it, sit tight for just a little bit. So we're going to go on with the hot topic starting now. Rabbi?
Matthew 23 contains within it probably the most serious charges against the Jewish people found anywhere in the Christian Bible. For those of you who have a background in Christian scholarship, Matthew 23 contains what's called a Q source, which means a source that both Luke and Matthew were appealing to, and an M source, texts that are completely unique to the book of Matthew. Matthew 23, it is often said that the most anti-Semitic book in the New Testament is the book of John. I don't believe that. I think it's not correct. There are reasons why people might suggest the book of John is most anti-Jewish, but I think that more Jews have been murdered by people who otherwise would have been completely moral if the book of Matthew had not been written. The Matthew 23 was included in the Christian canon by the author because it sought to frame the nature of the Jews. And this is very important. What Matthew seeks to convey from the very beginning, really since the infancy narrative in chapter 2, where the non-Jewish fellows from the east following a star are worshiping Jesus, but Herod and his hordes are trying to kill the Messiah. That's chapter 2. That theme just intensifies and explodes in Matthew 23. And for those of you who need some sort of framework, Matthew, a book of 28 chapters, Matthew 23 appears immediately before what's called the Passion Narrative. And the Passion Narrative means that these are the texts that describe Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection and all the events that surround it. And Matthew 23 needs to explain that the Jews are not just uninformed. That's very important. And Matthew 23 is going to explode with railing against the Jews. Now we find parallel passages in Luke 11 and so on, but it doesn't come close to what we find in Matthew. In Matthew, the Jews are not just mistaken about Jesus. In the book of Matthew, what we what comes into view is that the Jews know the truth about Jesus and reject him anyway. They're the enemies of God. That's very critical. This might be the difference between two words that are often presented as synonyms: heterodox and heresy. They're similar, but they're not the same. Heterodox means another opinion. The Jews just may not be informed. They might be wrong about very important things, and if we just share with them, they'll know. That is not the way Matthew is presenting the Jews. Certainly in Acts, when Paul is preaching to philosophers, their unbelief is excused by their ignorance. But that is not the Jews. The Jews know the truth. They are the enemies of God. And despite the fact that they know that Jesus is the Messiah, they reject him anyway, because they're the devils, and they always have been the enemies of God. They are hypocrites and vipers. Now, it's very interesting that the word hypocrite, we know. I can first of all assure you that Jesus never used this word. The reason for that, but it actually tells us a lot about the authors. That would be a Q source, but it tells us a lot about the author of the use of hypocrite, because there is no Hebrew word for hypocrite. I mean, in biblical Hebrew or Aramaic word. That's a Greek term, and there's just no Hebrew. There's no biblical word, biblical Hebrew. There is no Hebrew Aramaic word for it. Doesn't exist. That means nobody speaking Aramaic could have said, "You hypocrites." So it doesn't exist. But we're familiar with this term, hypocrite, because it's the language of theater, which tells us a lot about Matthew, or the author of Matthew. We don't know who wrote it, but it tells us a lot about whoever came up with this speech. It tells us a lot about him. And it's almost certainly him, because most people in the late ancient world were illiterate, and women certainly were. It's almost certainly a male, highly literate Christian, but someone who is from the Greco-Roman world. The word hypocrite doesn't mean what convention means today. The word hypocrite today means someone who is externally one way, and he's really a phony, and he's really something else. That's what the word conventionally, what hypocrite, that's not what the Greek word means. The Greek word hypocrite is very specific. It means a play actor. This is a word that if you were familiar with theater, it was a visual term. In fact, the word theater, also a Greek term, means to see. A hypocrite means a play actor. Its convention doesn't mean what it means today. But the point is, it's a term that would be used in the world of theater, and those who are acquainted with it, and understand this, that theater, meaning live stage performances, was born in the city-state of Athens roughly 2,500 years ago. This is theater. Although today the Chinese have theater, everybody has theater in the West and the East, but theater comes from Greece, comes from Athens. It was Roman, and it wasn't Jewish. Jews, this is not the language of Jews, because Jews are not watching theater. Unless they're very, very Hellenized. Jews, what is theater? They have no idea what that is. They have no idea. Hypocrites, in fact, we see the term hypocrites used in Matthew 6, in the Sermon on the Mount, and in Matthew 23. And this is a very visual term. If you look at Matthew, the person who wrote these texts is on Broadway. He's not in Jerusalem. He's on stage. He's not in the temple. He's ensconced in the Greco-Roman world. He is not in Jerusalem. He's in Athens. Because all of it, you wash your hands, the one side doesn't know what the other side does. Your tombs, you're like tombstones that are whitewashed on the outside, but inside you're dead. All those are very visual, powerful images that are would be unknown to the Jewish world, but very well known to the very well known to the Greco-Roman world. So the language that we encounter, as I said, this is not unique to Matthew, but Matthew is revved up. Matthew is far more anti-Jewish than Luke. Just understand, and is also is sloppier than Luke because he's in a rage. I mean, Luke is like Luke's passion narrative. Jesus' last words on the cross are, among them is, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. They, brackets, the Jews. You'll never find that in Matthew. Matthew is like, the Jews know exactly what they're doing. So Matthew is really charged up. And Matthew is going to, for a very important reason, Matthew must produce a chapter 23 where the Jews are told, you've killed the prophets, but not only that, you do the same thing. Not only that, you guys are familiar, you guys are responsible for all the innocent death in the world. In fact, Matthew 23, verse 35, this is really something that puzzles me. Matthew charges the Jews, the way it reads is that you are responsible for the murder of Abel. If you read it in a Christian, obviously a Christian Bible, it'll say to the murder, to the death of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah. Now, don't ask me how this happened. There are a number of people in the Jewish Bible with the name Zechariah. I could think of a few of them. There was a king of the king of Israel called Zechariah, the son of Jeroboam II. There is a Zechariah at the very end of the Jewish Bible, which means Chronicles, as in the Jewish Bible. And there was a priest, his name is Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada, and he was murdered in the temple by the altar. Very famous death. Now, just to explain this point, the Jewish Bible, which is very large, also covers a very large span of time. Unlike the Christian Bible, which covers a span of time of 70 years, the Jewish Bible covers a period of 3,500 years, from Adam, from creation, all the way to the building of the Second Temple. Well, guess what? If you go to the beginning of the Jewish Bible, who's the first person that was ever murdered? Abel. That means all you do is turn like 1 or 2 pages, and bingo, you're encountering the first murder ever in the Hebrew Bible. Abel, the son of Adam. Who is the very last person to be murdered in the Jewish Bible? The Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada. Okay? So what is being said is really quite, I don't want to say sophisticated, but the intent is very clear. You, the Jews, the Pharisees, you're responsible for the death, the religious Jews, because the Sadducees is not even on this, you're responsible for all the innocent blood shed, period. And it says that throughout life, throughout history, because it's from the beginning to the end. It means you're responsible for everything. Why is this important? Because you're going to see in a moment, the Jews are going to be doing things, whether it's the priest, the Caiaphas, or whether it's, they're going to be doing things that are really unimaginable. Now, there's just a little footnote here that must be said. As I mentioned, there are a handful of Zechariahs in the Jewish Bible. There's no doubt that the most famous one is the one that our listeners are certainly most acquainted with. He is the author of the book of Zechariah, one of the 15 latter prophets. As it turns out, Zechariah was not murdered. Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, wasn't murdered, but he's the most famous Zechariah. That means Matthew actually made a mistake. He got the wrong Zechariah. It's mind-blowing. Luke, as we see on many occasions, is much more careful. The cross-references in Luke 11, where he just says Zechariah and is smart enough to leave off the last name. But the key is Matthew actually got the wrong guy, because the guy who was murdered by the altar is someone completely different. That's your idea of the Word of God? It isn't. Now, why does Matthew engage in this fiery rage? And this is what we're encountering throughout Matthew, but it is now exploding, and Matthew is just tearing into the Jews. Again, not for being just wrong or missing the boat, as we find the pagan philosophers in that. No. The Jews know the truth, but they reject him anyway. And this is very, very unique. The first people to actually beat Jesus are Jews in Matthew 26. In fact, what we find in Matthew is that the Jews are really looking for false witnesses, 26:59, to testify against Jesus. Why would they be looking for false witnesses? Aren't they looking for the truth? I mean, the Jews are not just ill-informed. They're not mistaken about, in Christian terms, the most important thing that is recognizing the Messiah. They know the truth, but they're deliberately looking for false witnesses rather than seeking to just find and determine what the truth is. It says that. And not only that, we are told Matthew juxtaposes the Jews against Pontius Pilate, who knew, we are told in 27:18 of Matthew, that Pilate knew the Jews were wrong completely and that Jesus was innocent. And he said the reason the Jews are doing this is out of absolute envy for Jesus, not because they were seeking out justice. Pontius Pilate, you won't believe this. Do you know that Pontius Pilate, he was the prefect of Rome? I guess we'll call him a governor, whatever you want. Do you know that in the Ethiopian church, the Orthodox Ethiopian church, Pontius Pilate is regarded as a saint?
Wow.
I was right. In fact, I have a whole tradition that Pilate committed suicide because he felt so terrible at what he did. In fact, only in the book of Matthew, you'll find it nowhere else. Not only was Pontius Pilate cognizant completely of Jesus' innocence and was completely on to the nefarious motives of the Jews, his wife in 27:19, this is the only time in the entire corpus of the Christian Bible that that Pilate's wife is introduced. She had a dream and she knows that Jesus is innocent. So let's get the scene. Pontius Pilate, who's washing his hands, saying, "This man is innocent of all this, and I'm innocent of this blood." His wife is screaming. Again, the two Gentiles saying he's wrong. The Jews are screaming, literally screaming, "Crucify him, crucify." They're screaming that. And then Pilate says, what did he do? And the Jews then say this in 27, 22, 25. "We take his blood upon ourselves and our children." I would posit to you that more Jews were murdered because of this one passage in Matthew 27:25 than any other verse in the Bible. Because now what is in view is that the Jews are the enemies of God. They are collectively, this is very critical, because it's not saying you personally, you few are. That's not what's happening. The Jews are collectively expressing that they are the enemies of God and their children are. And this will have an enormous effect on later Christian thinkers who hated Jews. And they were rational. It's a mistake to say Luther was an anti-Semite. He was, but he would have been a great guy. It's this literature that poisoned him. And not only that, Matthew goes so far. You got to check this out. In Matthew 27, verse 54, after Jesus' crucifixion, after he's executed on the cross, a Roman centurion, you know what a centurion is? Most people think it's just a soldier. It's not. A Roman centurion was a very high-level Roman officer. In fact, you couldn't even be a centurion unless you were 30 years old and completely literate, and you had servants under you. A Roman centurion was like this is a very high-up individual. It was not a general, but it was an extremely, it was a spokesperson for Rome. And in fact, the centurion says, unbelievable, we find this also in Matthew, the centurion gets it. The guy, the Roman, at the cross says, surely he is the Son of God. So the centurion gets it and the Jews don't. Matthew 23, which I'm going to in a moment take apart, but you need to understand first of all, what the heck is Matthew 23 doing in there? Why is there this visceral explosion? I mean, David Duke on his worst day never said things about African Americans that Matthew advances throughout his gospel. It gets just two other points. It's very important because Matthew isn't stupid. There's a reason this is not like Matthew had a bad day, that he came home from work and his wife burnt dinner. This is a highly calculated chapter, a chapter that a lot of thought went into how to present the Jews as the devil. And just to explain that point, in Christian theology, the devil knows that Jesus is the Messiah and believes in God but rejects him anyway and is the arch enemy of God. It's very important. The devil isn't ignorant. He was the highest angel that went into rebellion against God. He knows the truth but rejects him anyway, and that's what the Jews are. And we see this, in case you think that I am, I want to present Christian writers in a light that's unflattering. Please, as I always say, read it for yourself. I just want to give you one other example of this, which I think is the most important. We find this in Matthew chapter 28, verse 11 through 14. And what happens there is that the women come to the tomb, there's an earthquake, the stone's rolled away, they're informed by an angel that Jesus rose from the dead. Fine. But what happens in Matthew is there's a cutaway. Because Matthew, this is an M source, only Matthew has this, Roman soldiers have been placed at the tomb to guard it, lest any of the Jews say that someone stole the body. And Matthew says, in fact, Jews have been saying this to this day. It's in the book of Matthew. What happens? There are Roman soldiers who are present when the women come to the tomb and find that Jesus rose from the dead. When that earthquake happens and the Roman soldiers see what has occurred, that Jesus rose from the dead, they fall on the floor in shock. And then what do next? You can imagine. They go back to the chief priest and go, "You are not going to believe what happened." They say to them, it happened. They told them the whole resurrection thing, the encounter of the women at the tomb. Now, any normal person who would discover that, who would be informed that Jesus rose from the dead, would go, if you're normal, even skeptical, but now you have Roman soldiers tell you, would go, really? We were wrong. We have to reassess ourselves. We made a terrible mistake. But that's not the Jews of Matthew. The Jews of Matthew, the priests, you know what they do instead? They said to them, you go and here's money, so they bribe them. The whole idea that the Jews control the world through money in the banks, that's where this comes from. You go and say, here's a whole bunch of money. They gave them what we're told is a large sum of money. And they're told, look, you go say that that you fell asleep, that the body was stolen, you fell asleep. And when this gets to the governor, we've got your back. What? Why would they do that? Only Satan would do that. Only the devil would do that, okay? Because this is critical. It's not like just they are under a misapprehension that Jesus is not the Messiah. They're finding out he rose to the dead, as we're told in Matthew, but they deny him anyway. Now, the only way Matthew 26 or 28 can make any sense is Matthew 23. Okay? So what's important to understand is Matthew 23, which contains a what's called a M source, means material that you'll only find in Matthew, and a Q source, which means material that you'll find both in Luke and in Matthew, like in Luke 11, Luke 20 and 21. This chapter is not any chapter, and it is not just a chapter that is very offensive, and it's not just a chapter that has had a deep impact on Christians who would otherwise have adored Jews, but Christians reading these texts could only draw the conclusion that the Jews and their children, and always throughout history, responsible for the innocent blood of everybody, from Abel, and then, oops, we got the wrong Zechariah. Okay, so let's first set that aside, so that we know what Matthew is doing. We also know a little bit about the use of this language. You wear wide phylacteries on the street so people will see you. They said the word theater actually means to see. So whoever wrote this, whoever is responsible for this kind of language, is very visual. It's the language of theater. This is not from the Jewish world. This comes from Athens. It's not from Jerusalem. So that's our start. I want to go to the next step. And that is this very serious charge that the Jews killed all their prophets. What is the charge that is most dangerous against the people, the lie that is most effective, that has the greatest possibility of success, of being believed, charges or claims or arguments that actually have a little bit of truth to it. If it has zero truth, it's completely out of space, Martians landed in a spaceship, so people will just dismiss it. But when a charge has a little bit of truth, so then there's a danger that it could be believed. And let me just illustrate this, and then we're going to go to this passage. Let me just give you one illustration that I think will convey this in a way that everyone can understand. As we know that throughout much of the world, maybe not the world of Montreal and Toronto, but in other parts of the world, Holocaust denial, Holocaust revisionism, the claim that the Holocaust never happened is widely disseminated among enemies of the Jews. Widely. Now, if you'll ask a Holocaust denier, and some of them are very highly educated people, David Irving. David Irving is not an idiot. David Irving wrote many, many books on World War II. He translated Goebbels' biography. He's not stupid people, okay? This is very important to understand. If you ask these individuals who deny the Holocaust, who say that the Jews invented it, never was. There was no systematic genocide of the Jews. Ask them, in order for that to be true, not only would the Jews have to invent it, but the Germans, we would have to convince the Germans that they did something that they know they didn't do. But setting that aside, if you asked any Holocaust denier, really, try it on your own, why did the Jews invent the Holocaust? What was the purpose of it? What was the motive? Why invent the fact that 1/3 of the Jewish people between 1940 and 1945 was systematically murdered by the Nazis? You ask them, But why would the Jews invent such a thing? So every Holocaust denier will tell you the exact same thing. They'll say that the Jews invented the Holocaust because they wanted to garner sympathy from the world's nations. Zionists wanted a racist state based on a lie, but they wanted the world to feel sorry for them. So they invented the Holocaust so the world would feel really bad for them. They would feel that there's an imperative to produce a Jewish state because, after all, the Jews need their own homeland. From the narrative of the alleged Holocaust, it appears very plain that the Jews cannot trust their host countries to defend their security. They need their own country. When Barack Obama doesn't believe this, but when he addressed a university in Cairo in the early part of his presidency, he very directly connected the state of Israel's legitimacy to the Holocaust. So this is widely, understood, state of Israel, Holocaust, and so on. So they'll say that the Holocaust the Jews invented it because there was a vote, a partition plan vote in November 1947, which the majority of the world, 33-13, voted for the partition of this land, this area of the world called Palestine. And had the world not been bamboozled, had they not bought into this bogus claim of a Holocaust, they would have never voted and supported a Jewish state. Okay? That's how it works. Now, once you recover from what I've just shared with you, I want to make a point here. As it turns out, there is within this charge, this very serious charge, there is an iota of truth in there. There is a kernel of truth in there. And I need to explain this point, and that is, anyone who has even a perfunctory knowledge of this troubled period of history recognizes that if there was not a Holocaust, it is not only unlikely, but any historian would tell you that the United Nations would have never passed the partition plan. It happens to be that what convinced many nations to support it was the belief that the Jews, in fact, needed. There was an historical imperative, given that 6 million Jews, that means all of European Jewry was destroyed, that they supported the Jewish state for that reason. And had there not, the European Jewry was not wiped out, it's not unlikely. In a million years, there would not have been, the world would have not, in this world body, supported a Jewish state. Okay? That is a fact. That does not mean the Holocaust didn't happen. Okay? But it gives the claim that the Jews invented the Holocaust, it gives that claim the kind of traction, because every lie that is successful has a little bit of truth, and everything else is one big lie. But it has to have that little truth. And then do you get the point? Okay, so obviously the Holocaust did happen, but on the other hand, it is true that the world's nations, the world body, the majority, would have not supported a Jewish state as it did. Okay. Now, that's exactly what's happening here in Matthew. As it turned out, what was the role of a prophet? So if I ask the question, what did prophets do? Most people say they foretold the future. That's not the role of a prophet. In fact, the word navi means to speak. That's where it comes from. Yes, prophets did foretell the future, but not always. Some did miracles, but the prophets weren't miracle workers. Jeremiah did perform miracles, neither did Isaiah. The role of a prophet was, let's just take Jeremiah and Isaiah, was to go not to Walmart, not to go to Stop and Shop, not to go to Ace Hardware or Home Depot, but to go into the house of the king, to the palace, and tell the king you are a sinner, and tell the king that you have turned away from the true God of Israel. Okay? And as you can well imagine, the most wicked kings, whether of Israel or the most evil kings, killed prophets. It was a very dangerous business. We know it. We know Achav, Jezebel. They wiped out prophets. But they were the most evil Jews in the world. As you could, I mean, these were like, insane. I mean, we had, Stella. What was her name? Stella Goldschlag. I mean, she was collaborating with the Nazis, as many Jews did, who were called grabbers, snatchers. They worked for the Gestapo to find Jews. They were Jews like this. These were the enemies of the Jewish people. So it's a very important point to remember, and most people just, it breaks my heart. It rips my kishkas to pieces. Most people have a Bible sitting on their shelf. They've read maybe the creation story. I'm not trying to be, but they're familiar with this. But when you get into the prophets, they're just not reading it. But I've got to just explain this point about prophets. The role of a prophet was, he did not waste his time running around to the average guy, the average Jew, who's in his accounting firm. Hello, and he goes in. The average prophet is not walking into McDonald's going, "What are you doing ordering a cheeseburger?" If you read the text, they did the thing that would get you killed. They walked in to the palace of the most wicked kings. Jeremiah almost got killed. A black slave saved him. He was. By the way, join me. I have a number of tours coming up in July. I'll show it to you, where Jeremiah was thrown to a pit of quicksand. He was saved. Isaiah was killed by Menashe. Jezebel and Achav, her husband, these two disasters, they killed so many prophets. There was a great man, even Obadiah, who saved many. But prophets were in grave danger. You imagine your job as a prophet. Here's your job. You got the most evil, whacked out king in the world, who is a killer, a murderer. Go into his palace and tell him that you're a sinner. Jeremiah would be giving prophecy to the king, and he'd be taking his prophecy and burning it in the fire. So yes, if you read the Jewish Bible will describe, first of all, the worst kings. If it's a king like Yotam, very little about him. Why? He didn't do anything wrong during his rule. We know that. The Tanakh is very interested in all the most horrible things the Jews did. And it kind of creates a skewed view. I'm not saying that it didn't happen. Of course it happened. Of course we have to learn from it. But there's not that much you can learn from Yotam. Why? Man didn't do very much. No one ever heard of him. But the kings who made mistakes, whether they were righteous kings who made horrible mistakes but confessed their sin, like King David, we can learn a lot from. When we see how vile Menashe was, who ultimately actually murdered Isaiah in the most horrible way imagined. So the answer is, yes, what this drivel of Matthew 23 is it has that kernel of truth. Why? Because what people don't know is they think, Jews went around just killing prophets. Are you insane? If you were in Walmart, you did not have to worry that Isaiah was going to come to you. Read it. He was running to the king. What do you think? Who did Jeremiah go to? So they went. Who did Elijah confront? Elijah survived. But boy, if it wasn't Elijah, he would have been schmeiced to pieces. So the answer is that the prophets were sent to the most psycho kings of the Jewish people. Primarily, the worst, of course, were from the northern kingdom of Israel. But there were some in the south who were horrible kings. And you were literally, I'm not saying committing suicide, but there There was a very good chance if you walked in. I mean, these were guys like. Helmut Goering, the second in command in the Third Reich, his right-hand man was a Jew. I know it sounds crazy, but he was. So you have the most evil people. But the enemies of Jezebel were religious Jews, Torah Jews, the very ones that we are to believe Jesus is cursing. These Jews who were Torah-observant Jews who loved Hashem, who worshipped Hashem, they would have been slaughtered by the very same kings who killed the prophets. So therefore, yes, technically speaking, not all the prophets were murdered. It's just not true. But many of them were killed. Why? Because they went to the most horrible kings, because that's what their job was. Their job was not to go into Jiffy Lube. I'm sorry, that was not their job. Their job was not go into Jiffy Lube and see who has a McDonald's cheeseburger. You won't find that anywhere. Their job was to go to the king, to approach and confront the absolute most powerful, diabolical people and say, you have sinned. In truth, when Nathan confronted King David in 2 Samuel chapter 12, David was a holy man. His repentance is unmatched. But he was taking his life into his hands. If David wasn't David HaMelech, whose repentance is what makes him so delicious, so we adore. The reason we adore him is because he said two words. Chatasi L'Hashem, I sinned before God. But he could have been killed on the spot when he said, David, you are that man. David was David, so David was different. But he could have been killed for it easily. He wasn't. So that's the answer. The answer is, there is in Matthew 23, the author of Matthew is in a very fumbling way. It's almost like God. What blows my mind away is that Matthew is constantly doing this. He's having Jesus in his triumphal entry going on two donkeys. He misreads Zechariah 9. He's got the wrong Zechariah. It's almost like some Jew went into the book of Matthew and changed it so that it would wink at all the other Jews going, this is not the word of God. They got the wrong Zechariah. I can't tell you that. I have no evidence for it, but it's almost inexplicable. You have even later on when Judas Iscariot throws the money down, the 30 pieces of silver, Matthew actually misquotes and says that this text is based on a passage in Jeremiah, which Matthew says it's not. It's from Zechariah. How do you get the wrong book in the Bible? I'm not making this up. It's Matthew 27, verse 9 and 10. It says, to fulfill what was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet, and they took 30 pieces of silver and the price of the people of Israel and so on. That verse is from Zechariah. What is even, it defies anything, but couldn't someone in the 2nd century have cleaned that up? They didn't, because they didn't care about the Jewish Bible in truth. But Matthew makes these blunders. But the reason why the charge has traction in Yiddish is hot feast is because there is a kernel of truth, just like Holocaust denial. That's why it does spread so well, because it's true that, if you were a prophet, you were in dangerous territory. You were asked to go to a king who was a murderer, a killer, an enemy of the very people that Jesus is cursing, and you could be killed, and prophets were killed. So therefore, it's the kernel of truth. And that's why I say to my holy brothers and sisters, I want to point this out. Read the Bible. I didn't share anything with you that's not plain in text and is not accessible to anyone. The use of the language of theater is, because again, hypocrite doesn't really mean what it means today, like you're a phony. It means you're a play actor. That's not, Jews didn't use that language, and we don't even have a word for it. There's no Hebrew Aramaic word. So that tells us a little bit about where this comes from. Whoever wrote it is from the Greco, from the Greco-Roman world. One other point I must say, there are many evangelical Christians who do love the Jewish people, who are raised that way, and when they're taught these texts, they're taught, oh, it doesn't mean all the Jews, it just means the leaders. You understand? And they mean well, so you've got to explain this slowly, but be very careful, because you have to know the passages, you have to know the Bible in order to know how to respond effectively in a way that's very meaningful to a Christian.
Rabbi, thank you so much for this wonderful show today.
Always a pleasure.
It has always been great. Ladies and gentlemen, tune in next week, same time, same place. Go visit Rabbi Singer. Hey, Rabbi, real quickly, tell me, I'm putting you on the spot here. I know you would never do this publicly. You have currently a GoFundMe campaign for a special. Could you please tell us about that real quickly?
We are spreading Torah throughout Indonesia. Hundreds of people are learning about the God of Israel, and we need to be able to continue this work for the next year on juicer.com. If you believe in the work that we're doing, please support us. Go on there, you'll find it on our Facebook, so that we can continue our work of bringing Torah to the furthest most island.
Amen and amen.
אדון עולם אשר מלך בטרם כל יציר נברא לעת נעשה בחפצו כל אזי מלך שמו נקרא ואחרי ככלות הכל לבדו ימלוך נורא והוא היה והוא הווה והוא יהיה בתפארה אדון עולם אשר מלך בטרם כל יציר נברא לעת נשא בחפצו כל אזי מלך שמו נקרא ואחרי ככלות הכל לבדו ימלוך נורא והוא היה והוא הווה והוא יהיה בתפארה אדון עולם אשר מלך בטרם כל יציר נברא לעת נשא בחפצו כל אזי מלך שמו נקרא ואחרי ככלות הכל לבדו ימלוך נורא והוא היה והוא הווה בתפארה והוא הווה והוא יהיה בתפארה אדון עולם אשר מלך בטרם כל יציר נברא לעת נעשה בחפצו כל אזי מלך שמו נקרא ואחרי ככלות הכל לבדו ימלוך נורא והוא היה והוא הווה והוא יהיה בתפארה אדון עולם אשר מלך בטרם כל יציר נברא לעת נשא בחפצו כל אזי מלך שמו נקרא ואחרי ככלות הכל לבדו ימלוך נורא והוא היה והוא הווה והוא יהיה בתפארה אדון עולם אשר מלך בטרם כל יציר נברא לעת נשא בחפצו כל אזי מלך שמו נקרא ואחרי ככלות הכל לבדו ימלוך נורא והוא היה והוא הווה בתפארה והוא הווה והוא יהיה בתפארה בחפצו כל אזי מלך שמו נקרא אדון עולם אשר מלך בטרם כל יציר נברא לעת נשא בחפצו כל אזי מלך שמו נקרא ואחרי ככלות הכל לבדו ימלוך נורא והוא היה והוא הווה והוא יהיה בתפארה אדון עולם אשר מלך בטרם כל יציר נברא לעת נשא בחפצו כל אזי מלך שמו נקרא ואחרי ככלות הכל לבדו ימלוך נורא והוא היה והוא הווה בתפארה והוא הווה והוא יהיה בתפארה והוא היה והוא הווה בתפארה והוא הווה והוא יהיה בתפארה